The desert sun cast long shadows across Silver Creek as Isabella Rodriguez was escorted through the dusty streets toward the town square. Her measured steps showed no sign of fear, despite the hostile crowd that had gathered to witness what they believed would be frontier justice. Her dark hair was neatly arranged, and her traveling dress remained dignified even in these circumstances. Two deputies flanked her as she walked, their hands resting on their gun belts more from nervousness than necessity. Isabella's calm demeanor seemed to unsettle them more than any struggle or protest might have. Her keen brown eyes observed every detail of her surroundings with the practiced attention of someone trained in careful observation. Sheriff Thomas Blake stood near the weathered wooden post in the center of the square, his silver badge gleaming against his dark vest. In his weathered hands, he counted a thick stack of bills with obvious satisfaction, occasionally glancing up to ensure his corrupt transaction remained unnoticed by the gathering crowd. The money disappeared quickly into his coat pocket as Isabella approached. "This Mexican woman has brought trouble to our peaceful town," Blake declared loudly, his voice carrying across the square as he addressed the assembled townspeople. "She has interfered with our business and threatened our way of life. The law demands accountability." Isabella lifted her chin with quiet dignity as the deputies secured her hands to the wooden post with rope. Though the situation appeared desperate, her posture remained straight and her expression composed. Her training had prepared her for moments exactly like this, when maintaining cover meant accepting temporary hardship for the greater mission. "Please listen carefully," Isabella said, her voice steady and clear despite the murmur of the hostile crowd. "You do not understand the true nature of what is happening here." The townspeople pressed closer, their faces showing the same mixture of suspicion and anger that had followed her since her arrival in Silver Creek. Children peered between adult legs while women whispered harsh judgments behind gloved hands. Men in dusty work clothes nodded approvingly at the sheriff's words. Sheriff Blake stepped forward with theatrical authority, playing his role for the crowd while the evidence of his corruption remained safely hidden in his pocket. The afternoon heat pressed down upon the gathering, and dust swirled around their boots as the wind picked up. Isabella's steady gaze surveyed the faces before her, noting details that would prove useful when the truth finally emerged. Her federal training had taught her patience, and she knew that justice, though delayed, would ultimately prevail in Silver Creek. 3 weeks earlier, Isabella Rodriguez had arrived in Silver Creek aboard the dusty stagecoach that connected the remote frontier town to the outside world. The wooden wheels creaked to a halt outside Morrison's general store, and Isabella stepped down onto the sun-baked earth, her leather boots creating small clouds of dust with each step. She wore a modest brown traveling dress with long sleeves and a high collar, appropriate for a respectable woman of the 1880s. A small carpetbag contained her few possessions, carefully chosen to maintain her cover as a traveling merchant seeking new opportunities in the growing territories. The townspeople stopped their daily activities to stare at the newcomer. Conversations died mid-sentence as suspicious eyes followed her movements. Isabella felt their scrutiny like a physical weight upon her shoulders, but she maintained her composure with practiced ease. "Another one of them coming to take our jobs," muttered old Pete Morrison as he swept the porch of his store. His words carried clearly in the still afternoon air, meant for all to hear. Isabella approached the general store with measured steps. "Good afternoon, sir. I am seeking information about lodging for the night." Morrison looked her up and down with undisguised distaste. "Mexican, are you?" He spat into the dust beside his boots. "We do not have much use for your kind around here." "I am a legitimate businesswoman," Isabella replied calmly, though her jaw tightened imperceptibly. "I have money to pay for my needs." "Money earned how?" Morrison, his voice dripped with suspicion. "Stealing from honest folks?" Other townspeople began to gather, drawn by the confrontation like vultures to carrion. Their faces showed the same mixture of hatred and fear that would later surround her at the whipping post. The Silver Creek Hotel stood at the corner of Main Street, its two-story wooden structure casting long shadows in the late afternoon sun. Isabella approached the establishment with determined steps, her carpetbag clutched firmly in her gloved hand. The hotel's painted sign creaked in the gentle breeze, advertising rooms for 50 cents per night. Behind the front desk stood Martha Henderson, a stern-faced woman in her 50s whose graying hair was pulled back in a tight bun. Her pale blue dress was pristine despite the dusty environment, and her sharp eyes missed nothing that occurred within her domain. "I would like to rent a room for several nights," Isabella said politely, placing a silver dollar on the wooden counter. Martha's expression hardened as she studied Isabella's features. "We do not rent to your people," she declared coldly. "This is a respectable establishment for decent folk only. I am a paying customer with legitimate business in your town," Isabella replied, maintaining her composure despite the familiar sting of rejection. "Your business is probably thievery or worse," Martha snapped. "I have heard about Mexican women and their immoral ways. You will find no welcome here." At that moment, Sheriff Thomas Blake entered through the hotel's front door. His heavy boots echoed against the wooden floor as he approached the desk. The silver star pinned to his black vest caught the lamplight, and his weathered face bore the hard lines of a man accustomed to frontier justice. "Is there trouble here, Martha?" Blake asked, his cold eyes focusing on Isabella with obvious suspicion. "This Mexican is trying to rent a room," Martha explained with disgust. "I told her we do not serve her kind." Blake nodded approvingly. "Good policy. We have enough problems without inviting more." He turned to Isabella with a threatening stare. "I suggest you find accommodations elsewhere, señorita." The next morning, Isabella made her way to the Silver Creek First National Bank, a sturdy brick building that stood as a symbol of prosperity in the growing frontier town. The brass nameplate beside the heavy wooden door gleamed in the morning sunlight, and the windows were protected by iron bars that spoke of the valuable contents within. William Hart, the bank president, sat behind an imposing mahogany desk in his private office. His expensive suit and gold pocket watch marked him as one of the wealthiest men in Silver Creek. When Isabella entered, his pale face immediately showed displeasure at her presence. "What do you want?" Hart asked curtly, not bothering to rise from his chair or offer her a seat. "I wish to open an account for my business transactions," Isabella replied professionally, producing a leather pouch containing silver coins. Hart glanced at the money with skepticism. "Where did someone like you acquire such funds? We do not deal with stolen property or blood money. My money is honestly earned through legitimate trade," Isabella insisted, though her patience was wearing thin. "I find that difficult to believe," Hart sneered. "Your people are known for dishonesty and criminal behavior. This bank serves respectable citizens only." As Hart spoke, Isabella's trained ears caught fragments of a hushed conversation from the adjoining room. Two men were discussing large sums of money, falsified documents, and shipments that needed to remain secret. Her federal training had taught her to recognize the signs of financial corruption, and every instinct told her that something illegal was occurring within these walls. "Perhaps you should try the Mexican banks south of the border," Hart continued with contempt. "They are more suited to your kind of business dealings." Isabella nodded quietly and prepared to leave, but her mind was already working to process the suspicious information she had overheard. That night, Isabella waited until the streets of Silver Creek fell silent under the pale moonlight. She had spent the evening in the shadows behind Murphy's saloon, observing the comings and goings of the townspeople. Now, dressed in dark clothing, she moved like a ghost through the deserted alleys toward the bank. Her federal training had taught her the skills of covert investigation, and she employed them now with practiced precision. The lock on the bank's rear door yielded to her carefully applied tools, and she slipped inside without making a sound. The interior of the bank was bathed in silver moonlight that streamed through the barred windows. Isabella's soft-soled boots made no noise on the wooden floor as she made her way to Hart's office. Her keen eyes had spotted a safe behind his desk during her earlier visit, and she suspected it contained the evidence she needed. Working by the dim light of a shielded candle, Isabella examined the documents scattered across Hart's desk. Bank ledgers showed discrepancies between deposits and recorded amounts. Letters bore the letterheads of mining companies that she knew had been under federal investigation for fraud. Most damning of all, she discovered correspondence between Hart and Sheriff Blake discussing the division of money from what they called special transactions. The corruption ran deeper than she had initially suspected, involving both the bank and the local law enforcement. Suddenly, footsteps echoed from the street outside. Isabella quickly extinguished her candle and pressed herself against the wall beside the window. Through the glass, she could see Sheriff Blake making his nightly rounds, his lantern casting dancing shadows on the buildings. The sheriff paused directly outside the bank, his head turning as if he sensed something amiss. Isabella held her breath, knowing that discovery would mean certain death in this hostile town where her word would count for nothing against that of the corrupt lawman. 2 days later, while taking refuge in the abandoned stable at the edge of town, Isabella overheard a conversation that chilled her blood. 3 rough-looking men had gathered in the shadows behind the building, unaware of her presence in the hayloft above. "Tomorrow at noon," growled Jake Morrison. Pete, his notorious outlaw brother who had returned to Silver Creek under cover of darkness. His weathered face bore scars from previous gunfights, and his cold eyes held no mercy. The bank will be nearly empty. Most folks will be at the church social. What about the sheriff? Asked Red Thompson, a man whose fiery hair matched his violent temper. His hand rested constantly on the grip of his holstered revolver, though Isabella noted he would not be allowed to use it in her story. Blake knows to be elsewhere, Jake replied with a cruel smile. Him and Hart have their arrangement. We take what we want, they claim it was more than it really was, and everyone profits except the poor fools who lose their savings. The third man, a thin figure called Snake Williams due to his slithering way of moving, nodded eagerly. And if anyone asks questions, we blame it on Mexican bandits. Perfect plan. Isabella's hands clenched into fists as she listened to their scheme. Not only were they planning to rob innocent people, but they intended to blame her people for the crime. The racism that had followed her since her arrival would provide the perfect cover for their theft. As the conspirators dispersed into the night, Isabella faced a terrible dilemma. She possessed crucial information that could prevent the robbery, but she had no way to report it to the authorities. Sheriff Blake was part of the conspiracy, and the townspeople would never believe the word of a Mexican woman against their own corrupt lawman. She would have to find another way to protect the innocent depositors of Silver Creek First National Bank. The next day dawned clear and bright, with most of Silver Creek's residents preparing for the weekly church social. Isabella watched from her hiding place as families in their Sunday best made their way toward the white wooden chapel at the far end of Main Street. The timing was exactly as the robbers had planned. At 11:30, Isabella positioned herself across from the bank, concealed behind a stack of grain barrels outside Morrison's general store. She carried no weapons, as her mission was investigation, not violence. Her only tools were her wits and her determination to protect innocent people. Jake Morrison and his accomplices approached the bank from 3 different directions, just as they had discussed. Isabella noted that Sheriff Blake was conspicuously absent from his usual patrol route, exactly as the conspirators had arranged. As the robbers entered the bank, Isabella sprang into action. She had spent the early morning hours preparing for this moment, and her plan was both simple and desperate. Moving swiftly but quietly, she made her way to the rear of the building where she had noticed a bell used to summon help in emergencies. The loud clanging of the alarm bell shattered the peaceful afternoon silence. Within moments, several men who had remained in town came running toward the sound. Among them was Deputy Marshal Frank Coleman, a younger man who had always seemed less prejudiced than his superior. "Bank robbery in progress," Isabella called out, though she remained hidden from view. Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to giving orders in crisis situations. The arriving men surrounded the bank just as Jake Morrison and his gang attempted to escape through the front door. Caught between the alarm and the unexpected response, the robbers found themselves trapped. Their carefully planned crime had been thwarted by the very woman they had intended to blame for their actions. However, Isabella's moment of triumph was short-lived. Within an hour of the failed robbery, Sheriff Blake had returned to town with a convenient story about pursuing rustlers in the hills. His face showed perfectly acted surprise and anger as he surveyed the scene of the captured robbers. But his cold eyes quickly found Isabella among the gathered crowd, and she knew her troubles were just beginning. "How convenient that this Mexican woman happened to be nearby when the robbery occurred," Blake announced loudly, his voice carrying across the town square. "Very suspicious timing, if you ask me. She sounded the alarm that saved the bank," Deputy Coleman protested, but his voice lacked conviction against his superior's authority. "Or she was supposed to be their lookout and panicked when things went wrong," Blake countered smoothly. "Everyone knows her people stick together. Mexican bandits working with a Mexican spy. It makes perfect sense." The crowd began to murmur agreement, their existing prejudices making Blake's false accusations seem reasonable. Isabella felt the familiar chill of injustice as hostile faces turned toward her with renewed suspicion and anger. "Search her belongings," Blake ordered. "I bet we find evidence of her involvement with these criminals." Of course, no such evidence existed, but Blake's deputies made a show of discovering items that could be interpreted as suspicious. A map of the territory became proof of bandit connections. Her modest savings became unexplained wealth that must have been stolen. "This woman is clearly guilty of conspiracy to rob our bank," Blake declared with theatrical indignation. "She may have pretended to help, but it was all part of their plan to throw us off the trail." William Hart emerged from the bank, his face flushed with false righteousness. She tried to open an account here with blood money. I should have known she was planning something like this. The crowd's anger grew with each accusation, and Isabella realized that her heroic actions had only painted her as a more cunning criminal in their prejudiced minds. And so Isabella found herself bound to the whipping post, the rope cutting into her wrists as Sheriff Blake prepared to deliver what he called frontier justice. The hostile crowd pressed closer, their faces twisted with hatred and bloodlust. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty town square. "Any last words before you receive your punishment?" Blake asked with mock ceremony, the leather whip coiled in his weathered hands. Isabella lifted her head with dignity despite her desperate situation. "I am Special Agent Isabella Rodriguez of the United States Federal Marshal Service," she declared, her voice carrying clearly across the square. "I carry credentials that prove my identity and authority." The crowd erupted in laughter and jeers. "More lies from the Mexican spy," someone shouted. "She will say anything to save her skin." But Isabella continued with calm determination. "Check the hidden compartment in my carpet bag. You will find my federal commission signed by the Attorney General himself. I was sent here to investigate reports of corruption involving this bank and your sheriff." Blake's face showed the first crack in his confident facade. "Desperate lies will not save you," he snarled, but his voice held a note of uncertainty. "Then examine the evidence," Isabella challenged. "Unless you are afraid of what you might discover." Before Blake could respond, the thunder of approaching horses echoed through the town. A cloud of dust rose from the main road as three riders in dark suits galloped toward the square. The lead rider carried a flag bearing the seal of the United States Marshal Service. The crowd fell silent as the federal marshals reined in their horses at the edge of the gathering. The lead marshal, a stern man with graying hair and steely eyes, dismounted and approached the whipping post with authority that brooked no challenge. "I am Chief Marshal Robert Hayes," he announced. "We received Agent Rodriguez's coded telegraph message 3 days ago. Release her immediately." Chief Marshal Hayes cut Isabella's bonds with swift, practiced movements while his fellow marshals kept their hands ready near their weapons. The crowd stood in stunned silence as the federal agents took control of the situation with quiet authority. "Agent Rodriguez has been investigating financial crimes in this territory for the past month," Hayes announced to the gathered townspeople. "Her evidence has uncovered a conspiracy involving bank fraud, corruption of local officials, and conspiracy to commit robbery." Sheriff Blake stepped backward, his face pale with the realization that his carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. "This is impossible," he stammered. "She is just a Mexican troublemaker." "Thomas Blake, you are under arrest for conspiracy, corruption, and abuse of office," declared Marshal Hayes as his deputies moved to surround the corrupt sheriff. "William Hart, you are also under arrest for bank fraud and conspiracy." Hart emerged from the crowd, his expensive suit wrinkled and his face sweating despite the cooling evening air. "You cannot prove anything," he protested weakly. Isabella rubbed her freed wrists and spoke with quiet dignity. "The evidence is hidden in your office safe, Mr. Hart. Bank records showing falsified deposits, correspondence detailing your arrangement with Sheriff Blake, and documentation of your deals with known criminals." As the federal marshals led Blake and Hart away in shackles, the townspeople began to understand the magnitude of their mistake. The woman they had been prepared to torture was not only innocent but had risked her life to protect their savings and expose the corruption that had infected their community. Deputy Coleman stepped forward, his young face flushed with shame. "Agent Rodriguez, on behalf of Silver Creek, I apologize for the terrible injustice you suffered here." Isabella nodded graciously. "Justice has been served, Deputy. Perhaps this experience will teach your community that a person's worth should be measured by their character and actions, not by the color of their skin or their place of birth." The setting sun cast long shadows across the town square as the people of Silver Creek began the difficult process of confronting their own prejudices.